You might notice a pattern over this last week. A week and a day ago was Corpus Christi Thursday, and Corpus Christi Thursday commemorated Holy Thursday and was honored, at least historically honored, with an octave, which ended yesterday. And when our Lord asked St. Margaret Mary he assigned her the task of getting this feast day, he asked that it would be on the Friday after the octave of Corpus Christi. Now, when Pope Pius XI elevated this feast, he gave it an octave as well in 1928, I think. And so now you have, after an octave that is commemorating Holy Thursday, now we have the gospel that is reminiscent of Good Friday. And both of these feasts are about the Holy Eucharist. Corpus Christi, commemorating Holy Thursday, is about the institution of the Eucharist and the priesthood and the Mass. And we celebrate that with processions of the Blessed Sacrament. And today we have then a feast of reparation for sins committed against the Eucharist, and also commemorating the Passion of the Lord, which then reminds us what the Mass really is all about. The Mass being the representation or representation of the Passion and the death of the Lord on Good Friday and his resurrection. So each of these mysteries is so big. It's too big just for one day. And so we have these wonderful processions for Corpus Christi, and now we have this whole month of June dedicated to the Sacred Heart. The whole month of June. We've just completed praying a novena to the Sacred Heart, which is a wonderful novena because it doesn't give you a chance just to name your intention once. It gives you a chance to name your intention 3 times. And you can come up with a different intention for each of those 3 times, or you just ask 3 times for the same intention. And our Lord has promised that if we knock, we ask, and we seek, that the Father will give us what we ask for in his name. So this is a very special time. We've just finished this novena to the Sacred Heart, and here we are on the solemnity itself. Now, on this feast, ideally, we could climb inside that wound in the side of Christ where the centurion thrust his spear and out flowed blood and water. But the devotion of the Sacred Heart really goes inside of that wound, right into his heart. And that's where we want to rest during this feast. And that's where we want to receive Holy Communion, right there next to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. So this feast also is about the Blessed Sacrament, the Eucharist, but from a different perspective, because today we consider the cold hearts of men who do not return the love of the Lord. One of the phrases that is used to describe the Eucharist for this feast is that it is the sacrament of his love. The Eucharist is the sacrament of his love because he died in order for this sacrament to be represented by priests. St. Alphonsus mentioned this to us, and for those of you who were at the presentation on the eternal priesthood Tuesday night, St. Alphonsus pointed out that it was necessary for our Lord to die so that there could be priests to perpetuate his presence on earth and to distribute his gifts, to offer sacrifice and to forgive sins. But the world has grown cold-hearted. Now, on the feast of the Stigmata of St. Francis, which is on September 17th, Stigmata of St. Francis of Assisi, the collect for that day mentions how when the world had grown cold of heart, that our Lord inflamed St. Francis by a seraph, which is an angel of fire, who inflamed the world through St. Francis by burning the wounds of Christ into his very flesh. Well, that certainly is an answer to prayer for St. Francis of Assisi. He prayed for that. He prayed that he could be wounded and that he could suffer and unite his sufferings with Christ. I'm going to open up for you here a really wonderful little chapter. I'm not going to read you the whole chapter, just a little bit here from St. Alphonsus de Liguori in his book on the Holy Eucharist. Now, in this book, he has meditations for the octave of Corpus Christi, a novena to the Sacred Heart, and then various meditations around the Sacred Heart and the practice of the love of Jesus Christ, keeping in mind that the Feast of the Sacred Heart and even the devotion to the Sacred Heart had not really been formulated or approved so much. So he's writing in 1726 that we must pray that the Holy Father will grant us this Mass and office and Feast of the Sacred Heart. So in 1726, when he's writing this, it was 1765 when the Mass and office were composed and promulgated by the Church. But the feast came later. Nevertheless, St. Alphonsus wishes to promote devotion to the Sacred Heart, and he relates the Sacred Heart with the Blessed Sacrament, with the Eucharist. Now let's listen to a couple of things that he has to say here. St. Denis says that the sacrament of the Eucharist is far more powerful for the sanctification of souls than all other spiritual means of grace. And St. Vincent Ferrer, that one communion does more for the soul than a week's fasting on bread and water. One communion does more for the soul than a week's fasting on bread and water. Now, how could that be? Fasting for a week on bread and water. Well, you'd certainly suffer. You'd certainly be hungry. But if it was done for natural means, well, all right, if you're just doing that to prove that you can do it, all right, well, you've proven that you can do it. But what is that going to merit for you? If you do it out of love of Christ, well, that will merit more for you, but not as much as the sacrament, because that fasting on bread and water is your act. You're doing that. But the Eucharist is what our Lord is doing, and you are receiving what He is doing, and you are receiving His very self, His very body and blood. So one communion, according to St. Vincent Ferrer, so wisely, one communion does more for the soul than a week's fasting on bread and water. Well, let's continue. St. Catherine of Siena once saw the host in a priest's hand, appearing as a globe of fire, and the saint was astonished that the hearts of all men were not burned up, and as it were reduced to ashes by such a flame. Such brilliant rays issued from the face of St. Rose of Lima after communion, as to dazzle the eyes of those who saw her, and the heat from her mouth was so intense that a hand held near it was scorched. So now we think about the cold hearts of humanity who look upon the Lord, who look upon Christians and Christianity with scorn, and they despise our Lord. Their hearts are cold. They don't know what they are doing. And then we think about that Eucharist in the hand of the priest that was aflame, and that Eucharist that St. Rose of Lima had consumed, and her breath was so aflame that hands were scorched that came near her. Wow. Well, let's continue. It is related that St. Wenceslas, by merely visiting the churches where the Blessed Sacrament was kept, he was inflamed by such an ardor that his servant who accompanied him did not feel the cold. if when walking on the snow he trod in the footsteps of the saint. St. John Chrysostom says that the most holy sacrament is a burning fire, so that when we leave the altar, we breathe forth flames of love, which make us objects of terror to hell. When we receive Holy Communion, that burning fire that is the Eucharist, that our breath is as flames of love that are a source of terror for hell. You see, if our hearts are cold, if we are indifferent, if we're distracted, we don't notice these things. That doesn't make them any less true, but we don't notice these things. Now, what confidence will we have in our prayers? What confidence will we have in preparing for Holy Communion? None of us prepare for Holy Communion well enough, myself included. The other night at our talk on the eternal priesthood, it talked about the careless priest and the lazy priest who didn't omit altogether their preparation for Mass, but did so hurriedly. And as I read that, I realized I make my preparation for Mass hurriedly, sometimes just rushing from the confessional right into Mass. Well, I need to find a better way of preparing in between those two things. Or maybe I need to prepare before hearing confessions. Or maybe Mass just needs to start another few minutes later than it already does. But even so, consider how we must prepare for Holy Communion, but also the thanksgiving we should give, and then being mindful of what we do after Mass. If the Eucharist is a flaming fire, and if our breath is burning with the love of Christ, and we are a terror to hell, now you don't want to go out provoking, the devil. You don't want to be doing that. But you want to be filled with the love of Christ, and to go out and realize that the Lord is placing people in your path for a reason. Maybe people who you would rather not talk to, but they're there in your path, and you have something to give to them. You have that burning flame of breath from the Holy Eucharist, and you might just be the bringer of peace. You might just be the bringer of peace into a life that is not at peace. You just never know. You might scorch somebody's hand if they come too near you, like what happened with St. Rose of Lima. St. Gregory of Nyssa says that communion is precisely this cellar of wine in which the soul becomes so inebriated with divine love that it forgets and loses sight of creatures. And this is that languishing which, with love of which the spouse again speaks in the Canticle of Canticles, "Stay me up with flowers, compass me about with apples, because I languish with love." And that really is what the Feast of the Sacred Heart is all about. It's about the sacrament of love. It's about the wound in the side of Christ, which, if we were to enter into, we would encounter his heart. And it's there that we want to be when we receive Holy Communion. A communion of reparation. Reparation for all those who receive communion carelessly, or for those who do not go to Mass at all. Sunday's Gospel for the Sunday in the octave of Corpus Christi, which we didn't celebrate because we had the external solemnity, but the Sunday night Mass heard this. It was about the Master, the Lord, who prepared a great banquet, and all those who were invited had an excuse not to come. Either an excuse because they'd gone shopping and they wanted to go play with their toys. I'm paraphrasing it. Or those who wanted to go and enjoy themselves, or those who put their family first. The newly married who wanted to spend time with his wife and not come to Mass together, which they should. So we think about all the excuses that people make for not going to Mass. We think about the excuses that we make for not doing those things that we know we should. Maybe you go to Mass every Sunday. Well, that's good. But all of us have something that sort of gnaws away at us, and we think, oh, I should be doing that. But, ... We make an excuse. Well, we need to not be making excuses, because the whole world is making excuses. And how few people there are who are attending Mass today. We have a nice crowd today, and I appreciate you all being here. I really do. It means so much. But where is the rest of the world? And that is all the more reason why we must make a communion of reparation, that we would offer our beautiful souls in a state of grace for the Lord to enter into. And of course, our souls can never be as pure as the Blessed Virgin Mary's Immaculate Heart. And St. Louis de Montfort recommends that we ask Mary to lend us her Immaculate Heart, and that we would receive Holy Communion into her Immaculate Heart. And the Lord would be so pleased because her Immaculate Heart is so beautiful, and Mary will give that to us, and we can receive Holy Communion into her Immaculate Heart, and then we benefit from that with all the graces that our Lord wishes to give us through her. But we need to go inside that Sacred Heart through the wound of Christ into Jesus' heart and rest there and receive a communion close to his heart and with the heart of Mary. And what a beautiful communion that will be, and how pleased our Lord will be. And that is a communion of reparation for all those who do not receive Holy Communion with a loving heart, or those who are not mindful, those who would not receive Holy Communion worthily. But our Lord wants us to receive Holy Communion. He wants us to prepare ourselves. And it's so easy to do. It's really so easy to do. Our Lord gives us everything we need to prepare ourselves, to have beautiful souls in a state of sanctifying grace, to come close to him in his Sacred Heart. Do you have a crucifix in your home? Do you have a crucifix in the main room of your home? When people enter your home, do they know that you're a Catholic? Well, the crucifix, we could say, is the original Sacred Heart image. The enthronement of a crucifix in your home goes back to the earliest devotion to the Sacred Heart. And then we have images of the Sacred Heart, like this fine statue here, or the paintings or images of the Sacred Heart. Have you enthroned your home to Christ the King, to the Sacred Heart of Jesus? Well, if you've not yet done so, this is a good month to do so. You don't need the priest there to do it, but I'm happy to come and help you to do that. It's an easy enough thing to do. We just have to coordinate it on our calendars, and I'm happy to do that with you. I've done it for many houses in the parish already over the last few years, and it's so good for the world to have a house, a home enthroned to the Sacred Heart of Jesus and the Immaculate Heart of Mary. Every home on that street benefits. Every family on that street benefits. It's kind of like when you receive the Holy Communion and your breath is on fire with the love of Christ. And everyone benefits from that. So let us continue with this sacrament of the Lord's love, this Holy Mass. Let us come to communion today with hearts aflame that will be set aflame by the Holy Eucharist. And then, well, the Lord wishes to answer our prayers. So we need to continue to pray. And pray, and pray, and pray, and pray. It's all so very simple. So a blessed feast to you. Let us enjoy this feast and this beautiful Mass, And let us experience the love of the Lord overflowing, and may that love of the Lord overflow through us out into the world. Nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen.